They tell you this is the summit of human progress. They tell you there is nothing beyond this order of things, no higher form of social life, no deeper freedom, no truer justice. They tell you that inequality is natural, exploitation inevitable, and suffering the price of civilization. And they repeat this lie so relentlessly that it begins to sound like common sense. That, comrades, is precisely why the system needs you to believe it. For if you were to recognize that this world is not the best that can be built, you would also recognize that it is not eternal. And once you understand that what has been made by human hands can be unmade by human struggle, the spell of power is broken. Capitalism presents itself not as a historical arrangement, but as fate. It disguises social relations as laws of nature. Profit becomes efficiency. Exploitation becomes opportunity. Poverty becomes personal failure. In this way, the system absolves itself of responsibility while placing the burden of its contradictions upon the backs of those it exploits. You are told to adapt, to compete, to improve yourself endlessly, never to question the structure that profits from your exhaustion. But let us tear away this veil. Under capitalism, labor is not a means of human fulfillment, it is a commodity. Your time, your strength, your creativity are bought as cheaply as possible and sold at the highest return. The wealth of society grows, yet those who produce it remain insecure, overworked, and disposable. This is not a failure of the system, this is its success. Capital accumulates precisely because workers are alienated from the products of their labor, from the process of work, from one another, and ultimately from their own human potential. The system must convince you that this is the best it can be because it cannot survive your consciousness. It requires resignation. It requires isolation. It requires that each worker see the other not as an ally, but as a rival. Divided, you bargain individually against forces that are global, organized and ruthless. United, you would become the very power that capital fears most. Observe how crises are explained. When markets collapse, when wages stagnate, when housing becomes unreachable and life itself unaffordable, you are told this is mismanagement, corruption, or unfortunate circumstance. Never are you told the truth that crisis is woven into the fabric of capitalism. Production is social, but appropriation is private. This contradiction cannot be reformed away. It can only be overcome. The ruling class maintains its dominance not only through ownership of factories, land, and machines, but through control of ideas. The dominant ideology of every age is the ideology of the ruling class. Schools train obedience, not critical thought. Media celebrates wealth, not work. Politics offers choices without alternatives, debates without substance, change without transformation. All the while, the worker is told to be patient, grateful, realistic. Realistic for whom? It is deemed unrealistic to demand dignity, yet entirely realistic to accept a lifetime of precarity. It is called utopian to imagine a society organized around human need, yet practical, to allow millions to suffer so that a few may accumulate excess beyond measure. This inversion of reason is not accidental, it is essential to maintaining the existing order. But history does not move by permission of the powerful. It moves by struggle. Every advance in human freedom has been won against the claim that this is the best it can be. Feudalism once declared itself eternal. Monarchs ruled by divine right until the masses learned otherwise. Capitalism, too, will fall not because it is immoral in the abstract, but because it is materially incapable of delivering the freedom it promises. The working class is not a victim awaiting rescue. It is the agent of historical transformation. When workers recognize themselves as a class not fragmented by nationality, race, or profession, but united by their relation to production, they become a force capable of reshaping society. Class consciousness is not merely awareness of suffering, it is understanding its cause and its remedy. The system fears organization more than anger, solidarity more than protest, clarity more than outrage. That is why it distracts you, exhausts you, and keeps you running in place. It needs you to believe that resistance is futile, that alternatives are impossible, that tomorrow must resemble today. But another world is not only possible, it is necessary. A society in which production is organized for use, not profit, in which labor is cooperative, not coerced, in which the immense productive power created by humanity serves humanity itself. This is not a dream detached from reality. It is the logical resolution of capitalism's own contradiction. Do not ask whether such a transformation is permitted. Ask whether the present system deserves to continue. Do not ask whether the ruling class will allow change. No ruling class has ever allowed its own abolition. Change is not granted, it is taken. Workers of the world, you have nothing to lose but the illusion that this is the best it can be. And you have a world to win. Capitalism survives not by presenting itself as a choice, but by disguising itself as fate, as though it were an unchanging law of nature rather than a historically produced system built through violence, enclosure, conquest, and exploitation. It teaches people to see its structures as inevitable, its hierarchy as natural, and its injustices as unfortunate but unavoidable. In doing so, it strips society of historical memory and replaces it with resignation. What is presented as the way things are is in fact the result of specific social relations. Yet those relations are hidden beneath abstractions like markets, growth, efficiency, and competition, which appear neutral while masking power. Capitalism depends on this illusion, because its legitimacy collapses the moment people understand that it is neither eternal nor necessary. If exploitation is perceived as fate, resistance seems irrational. If poverty is seen as personal failure, solidarity becomes unnecessary. If inequality is framed as the outcome of talent and effort, then the immense concentration of wealth appears justified. The system thus transforms structural violence into individual responsibility, making workers blame themselves for conditions imposed upon them. Long hours, insecure employment, and stagnant wages are explained not as consequences of capital's need to extract surplus value, but as the price of realism in a competitive world. This disguise is reinforced through ideology, which presents capitalism as the final stage of human development. History is portrayed as a linear march that ends with the market, as if no other form of organizing production could possibly exist. Past systems are treated as primitive errors, while the present is framed as mature and rational. In this narrative, capitalism is not one mode of production among others, but the horizon of all thought. Imagination itself is disciplined, constrained to reforms that leave the underlying relations of ownership untouched. Anything beyond this is labeled naive, extremist, or impossible. The language of economics plays a crucial role in this mystification. Terms like the economy are spoken of as though they were external forces, immune to human will, demanding sacrifice and obedience. Workers are told that wages cannot rise because the economy would suffer, that jobs must be cut to reassure markets, that social needs must wait for growth. In reality, these are not natural laws, but decisions made to protect profit. Yet by removing human agency from economic outcomes, capitalism portrays itself as an impersonal mechanism rather than a social system that benefits a specific class. This illusion is most effective because it is lived daily. Workers experience the pressure of rent, debt, and survival as constant facts, not as political conditions. The necessity to sell labor in order to live appears as a universal human condition, rather than a requirement imposed by private ownership of the means of production. When survival depends on wages, questioning the wage system itself feels dangerous, even absurd. Capitalism thus embeds its logic into the rhythms of everyday life, making alternatives seem abstract while exploitation feels concrete. Education, media, and culture reinforce this sense of inevitability. From an early age, individuals are trained to compete rather than cooperate, to measure worth through productivity, and to accept hierarchy as merit. Success stories are celebrated as proof of fairness, while failure is individualized and moralized. Structural analysis is discouraged, replaced by motivational slogans that promise empowerment without transformation. In this way, capitalism converts its victims into its defenders, convincing them that the problem is not the system but their own insufficiency within it. Crises expose the fragility of this disguise, yet even collapse is reinterpreted to preserve the illusion of fate. Economic breakdowns are framed as unfortunate cycles, technical miscalculations, or external shocks, never as expressions of capitalism's internal contradictions. Workers are asked to endure austerity, unemployment, and insecurity in the name of recovery, while capital consolidates and emerges stronger. Suffering is normalized, patience is demanded, and the promise of eventual stability is endlessly deferred. The greatest threat to capitalism is the realization that what appears inevitable is in fact contingent. Once people understand that capitalism had a beginning, they can grasp that it can have an end. Once labor recognizes itself not as an individual struggle but as a collective force, the myth of fate dissolves. The system's power rests not only on ownership and coercion, but on belief. To break that belief is to reveal that history is not finished, that social relations are made and can be remade, that human beings are not condemned to live under conditions they did not choose and do not control, that the present order persists only so long as it is mistaken for destiny. Exploitation under capitalism is not an accidental injustice that can be corrected with minor reforms. It is the very mechanism that drives the system forward. Capital does not grow through fairness, balance, or mutual benefit, but through the extraction of surplus value from labor. Workers are paid less than the value they create, and this unpaid labor is accumulated as profit. Without this systematic imbalance, capital would cease to expand, and the system would collapse. Exploitation is therefore not a moral deviation from capitalism's promise but the condition of its existence. The capitalist purchases labor power as a commodity not to satisfy human needs but to generate more value than is invested. This transaction appears, equal on the surface, a contract freely entered into between worker and employer. Yet beneath this appearance lies coercion. The worker, deprived of access to the means of production, must sell labor in order to survive. Choice exists only in form, not in substance. Hunger, rent, debt, and insecurity compel submission, transforming the wage relation into a disguised form of domination. This exploitation intensifies as productivity increases. Technological advancement under capitalism does not liberate workers from toil, it refines the means of extraction. Machines, automation, and digital systems are introduced not to reduce working hours or improve life, but to increase output and discipline labor. As productivity rises, wages stagnate or fall, while profits soar. The worker produces more in less time, yet receives no corresponding share of the wealth created. Efficiency becomes a weapon, accelerating exploitation rather than abolishing. Capitalism depends on competition between workers to maintain this dynamic. By keeping labor fragmented, insecure, and replaceable, capital suppresses resistance. Unemployment is not a failure of the system, but a necessary feature, a reserve army of labor that disciplines those still employed. The constant threat of job loss forces workers to accept lower wages, longer hours, and deteriorating conditions. Fear becomes an economic tool, ensuring that exploitation remains normalized and uninterrupted. Even suffering is repackaged as opportunity. Long hours are framed as ambition. Precarious work is sold as flexibility. Exhaustion is romanticized as hustle. In this ideological inversion, exploitation is no longer recognized as exploitation. It is internalized as personal striving. Workers are encouraged to identify with capital's goals, to see the success of the enterprise as their own, even as they are excluded from its rewards. The more they give, the more they are told they must give, until life itself is consumed by work. Global capitalism extends this exploitation across borders, turning entire regions into sources of cheap labor and raw materials. Wealth accumulates in imperial centers while poverty is exported to the periphery. This unequal exchange is not a distortion of the global system but its foundation. The prosperity of some nations rests on the superexploitation of others, enforced through trade agreements, debt, and political pressure. Capital flows freely, while workers are confined by borders, laws, and violence. Attempts to humanize capitalism through regulation or welfare do not eliminate exploitation, they merely manage it. Concessions are granted only when struggle forces them, and they are withdrawn when profitability is threatened. Reforms that leave private ownership intact cannot alter the fundamental relation between capital and labor. As long as production is organized for profit rather than need, exploitation will persist, adapting to new conditions while preserving its core function. Capitalism must conceal this reality to survive. It promotes the myth that profit is the reward for risk, innovation, or genius, obscuring the collective labor that produces all wealth. It celebrates individual success stories to hide systemic inequality. By focusing attention on consumption rather than production, it diverts scrutiny from the process through which value is created and appropriated. Exploitation becomes invisible even to those who experience it daily, yet the system betrays itself through its own contradictions. The more wealth it produces, the deeper inequality becomes. The more productive labor grows, the more precarious life becomes. These are not anomalies, but expressions of a system driven by exploitation. To understand this is to strip capitalism of its moral justifications and reveal it as a social order that feeds on human labor while denying workers control over their own lives. Once exploitation is recognized not as a flaw to be fixed, but as the engine that powers the entire structure, the necessity of dismantling that structure becomes undeniable, and the struggle for a new mode of production grounded in collective ownership and human need emerges not as idealism, but as material necessity. Ideological control is the silent architecture of class domination, operating not through open force alone, but through the shaping of thought, perception, and belief. The ruling class does not rely solely on its ownership of factories, land, and capital. It rules by making its worldview appear universal, natural, and unquestionable. The ideas that dominate society are not neutral reflections of reality, but expressions of material power produced and circulated to secure obedience without constant coercion. When domination is internalized, resistance appears irrational, and submission feels voluntary. Under capitalism, ideology works to conceal the true nature of social relations. Exploitation is obscured by narratives of freedom, equality, and choice. The worker is told they are free because they may choose their employer, yet the necessity to sell labor in order to survive is never questioned. Formal equality before the law masks material inequality in life. The contract between worker and capitalist is portrayed as fair exchange, while the extraction of surplus value remains hidden behind legal and moral abstractions. Ideology transforms structural domination into personal circumstance. Education plays a central role in this process. Rather than cultivating critical understanding of society, it trains individuals to adapt to existing conditions. Discipline, punctuality, competition, and obedience are rewarded, while questioning the foundations of the system is discouraged. Knowledge is fragmented and depoliticized, stripped of its historical and class context. Students are prepared not to transform the world, but to fit into predetermined roles within it, learning to measure their worth by productivity and compliance. Media reinforces this domination by controlling the boundaries of acceptable thought. What is debated is limited to what does not threaten property relations. Inequality is discussed as a technical problem, never as a class relation. Crises are framed as failures of individuals or institutions, not as expressions of systemic contradiction. The constant repetition of ruling class perspectives gives them the appearance of common sense, while alternative analyses are marginalized, ridiculed, or silenced. Visibility is power, and the ruling class decides what may be seen and heard. Culture further naturalizes domination by shaping desire itself. Consumption is presented as the highest form of freedom, reducing human fulfillment to purchasing power. Identity is constructed through brands, status and lifestyle choices, diverting attention from collective conditions to individual expression. Art, entertainment, and popular narratives celebrate success stories that imply universal opportunity, while obscuring the millions whose labor makes such success possible. Class struggle is erased, replaced with stories of personal triumph and moral virtue. Religion and moral ideology have historically served similar functions, teaching acceptance of suffering and promising reward elsewhere. In modern capitalism, this role is often played by secular myths of meritocracy and progress. Workers are told that hard work leads to advancement, despite overwhelming evidence that wealth reproduces itself across generations. Failure is moralized, success sanctified. This moral framing justifies inequality while discouraging collective resistance, as individuals turn inward rather than outward in search of solutions. Ideological control also fractures the working class internally. Divisions based on race, nationality, gender, and culture are amplified to prevent unity. These divisions are not accidental. They are cultivated to redirect anger away from capital and toward other workers. When exploitation is experienced differently across groups, ideology insists these differences are natural rather than strategically produced. Solidarity is undermined, and class consciousness is delayed or distorted. The power of ideology lies in its invisibility. Those subjected to it often do not experience it as domination, but as reality itself. The most effective ideology is one that does not announce itself as such. It embeds itself in language, habits, institutions, and assumptions about what is possible. When workers cannot imagine an alternative to capitalism, domination no longer requires constant repression. The system is defended by those it exploits because it has colonized their understanding of the world. Yet ideology is never total. Contradictions emerge where lived experience clashes with official narratives. Workers sense the injustice of a system that demands ever more while giving ever less. Moments of crisis expose the fragility of dominant ideas, revealing that what was presented as necessity was always a choice made in the interests of capital. When these cracks widen, consciousness shifts from acceptance to questioning, from questioning to understanding. Class domination persists only so long as the ruling ideas remain unchallenged. To confront power materially, it must first be confronted ideologically. The task of emancipation begins with unveiling the hidden relations behind everyday life, with recognizing that ideas are not detached from production but arise from it. As workers grasp that the dominant ideology serves a dominant class, they begin to see their own conditions not as personal failures or eternal facts, but as historically produced relations that can be collectively transformed as consciousness moves from isolation to solidarity, from belief to critique, from acceptance to struggle. Division is not merely a byproduct of capitalist society, it is one of its most carefully maintained conditions. Power understands that workers, when fragmented, are manageable, predictable, and weak. Isolated individuals negotiate from positions of desperation, but a united class negotiates from strength. Capital therefore invests enormous effort into preventing unity, because unity transforms labor from a resource to be exploited into a force capable of resistance. The fear of collective power lies at the heart of every strategy that pits worker against worker. Capitalism teaches competition as a moral virtue. From the earliest stages of life, individuals are trained to see one another as obstacles rather than allies. Success is framed as personal achievement detached from social conditions, while failure is individualized and shamed. This ideology ensures that workers internalize rivalry, measuring themselves against one another instead of questioning the system that exploits them all. When workers compete, wages are driven down, conditions deteriorate, and resistance dissolves. into resentment. Division is reinforced through material insecurity. Precarious employment, short-term contracts, and the constant threat of unemployment ensure that workers remain fearful and compliant. The existence of a surplus labour force is not accidental, it is essential. Those without work serve as a warning to those with it, reminding them that resistance carries consequences. In this climate of fear, solidarity appears risky, while silence seems rational. Capital thus transforms insecurity into discipline. Social divisions are weaponized to deepen this fragmentation. Differences of race, nationality, gender, religion, and culture are magnified and politicized to obscure shared material conditions. Workers are encouraged to blame one another for scarcity rather than the system that produces it. Migrants are portrayed as threats rather than fellow laborers. Cultural conflicts are amplified to prevent class identification. These divisions do not originate spontaneously. They are cultivated because they redirect anger away from capital and toward vulnerable targets. The workplace itself is organized to prevent unity. Hierarchies, surveillance, and individualized performance metrics isolate workers from one another. Collective discussion is discouraged, unionization resisted, and dissent punished. Management presents itself as neutral coordination rather than class. Authority, while demanding loyalty and identification with corporate goals. Workers are encouraged to see the success of the enterprise as their own, even when they have no control over its direction or rewards. History demonstrates that whenever workers overcome these divisions, power responds with force. Every gain achieved by labor has come through collective struggle, and every such struggle has been met with repression, co-optation, or ideological attack. Unions are weakened, strikes criminalized, and collective action portrayed as irresponsible or dangerous. The ruling class understands that. Unity is not merely a demand for better conditions, but a challenge to its authority over production itself. Unity threatens power because it reveals a fundamental truth: capital depends entirely on labor. Machines do not produce value on their own. Markets do not function without human activity. The immense wealth of society is created collectively, yet appropriated privately. When workers recognize this, the myth of capitalist indispensability collapses. Power no longer appears natural or necessary, but contingent upon continued obedience. Solidarity transforms consciousness. It replaces competition with cooperation, isolation with shared purpose, and fear with collective confidence. Through organization, workers learn that their struggles are not individual misfortunes, but expressions of a common condition. This recognition is the foundation of class consciousness, the understanding that liberation cannot be achieved alone, but only together. Unity does not erase difference. It situates difference within a shared struggle against exploitation. Capitalism seeks to convince workers that unity is unrealistic, that collective action belongs to the past, that society is too complex, too diverse, too divided for solidarity. Yet complexity is not an obstacle to unity. It is the reason unity is necessary. Fragmented struggles are easily absorbed, but organized movements reshape history. The ruling class fears not anger, but coordination, not protest, but sustained organization. When workers unite, they challenge not only wages and conditions, but the very logic of a system that thrives on their division. Unity exposes that what appears as individual weakness is in fact collective strength denied expression. It reveals that power flows upward from labor, not downward from capital. To divide workers is to maintain domination. To unite them is to threaten it at its root. Because unity turns labor into a conscious force capable of reclaiming control over production, over society, over the conditions of life itself. Class consciousness is not an abstract idea or a moral awakening. It is a material realization born from lived conditions and collective struggle. It emerges when workers cease to interpret their suffering as isolated misfortune and begin to understand it as the shared outcome of a specific social order. This shift in awareness transforms passive endurance into active resistance. Without class consciousness, exploitation is experienced but not comprehended. And without comprehension, there can be no sustained challenge to the system that produces it. Capitalism works relentlessly to prevent this realization. It fragments experience, encouraging individuals to see their lives as separate trajectories rather than interconnected processes shaped by common forces. Workers are taught to identify themselves by profession, status, or income level rather than by their relation to production. This fragmentation conceals the fact that all who must sell their labor to survive belong to the same class, regardless of superficial differences. Class consciousness begins when these divisions are recognized as artificial barriers imposed to weaken collective power. The development of class consciousness is inseparable from struggle. It does not arise simply from reading theory or observing injustice from a distance, but through confrontation with exploitation in daily life. Long hours, inadequate wages, insecure employment, and the erosion of dignity force questions that ideology cannot permanently suppress. When workers organize, strike, or resist, they learn through action that their power lies not in individual effort but in collective withdrawal of labor. Practice educates where ideology deceives. This consciousness reveals the true nature of the wage relation. What once appeared as a fair exchange between employer and employee is exposed as a mechanism of extraction. Workers begin to see that profit is not created by management, innovation, or risk-taking alone, but by their own unpaid labor. This understanding undermines the moral legitimacy of capital and reframes social conflict not as a dispute over distribution, but as a struggle over control of production itself. Class consciousness also reorients the understanding of history. Instead of viewing social change as the result of heroic individuals or benevolent leaders, workers recognize the central role of collective action. History appears not as a series of accidents or reforms, but as a record of class struggle driven by conflicts between those who own the means of production and those who produce the wealth of society. This perspective restores agency to the oppressed, revealing them not as victims of history but as its makers. The ruling class fears this consciousness because it dissolves the illusions that sustain domination. Once workers understand that the state, law, and ideology exist to protect property relations, loyalty gives way to skepticism. Institutions once seen as neutral are revealed as instruments of class power. Political promises lose their persuasive force when workers recognize that true change cannot occur without transforming the underlying economic structure. Reform without structural change is understood as containment rather than liberation. Class consciousness is inherently international. Capital operates across borders, exploiting labor wherever it is cheapest and weakest. When workers understand their position as part of a global class, nationalist divisions lose their grip. Solidarity expands beyond borders, challenging the system that pits workers against one another in a race to the bottom. This international perspective does not deny local struggles, but situates them within a global structure of exploitation. The emergence of class consciousness does not produce uniformity of thought or experience. It does not erase cultural, social, or personal differences. Rather, it provides a framework through which these differences can coexist within a shared struggle. Unity is built not on sameness, but on recognition of common material interests. Through this recognition, individual grievances are transformed into collective demands, and scattered resistance becomes organized movement. Revolutionary change does not begin with the seizure of power. It begins with the transformation of consciousness. Without class consciousness, any uprising remains reactive and temporary, easily absorbed or defeated. With it, struggle becomes strategic, sustained, and directed towards systemic transformation. Class consciousness turns anger into purpose, suffering into understanding, and resistance into organized force. It reveals that the conditions imposed by capitalism are not immutable laws, but social relations that persist only because they are accepted. As this awareness spreads, obedience erodes, legitimacy fractures, and the foundations of the existing order begin to weaken, because a class that understands itself as a class begins to act as one, no longer seeking relief within the system but questioning the system itself, recognizing that liberation cannot be granted from above but must be constructed from below through collective control over labor, over production, over the material conditions that shape human life. The truth the system fears most is now clear. Nothing about this order is natural, eternal, or inevitable. Capitalism survives by convincing you that it is destiny, by extracting life through exploitation, by ruling through ideas that disguise domination, by dividing those whose unity would end its power, and by suppressing the consciousness that would expose its fragility. Every mechanism of control points to the same fear that once workers understand their position in history, the existing order cannot endure. You are not powerless individuals trapped inside an unchangeable world. You are the producers of all wealth, the carriers of all social labor, the force upon which every institution depends. The factories, offices, supply chains, and digital networks do not function by the will of capital, but by your daily activity. When this reality is grasped collectively, obedience loses its meaning and resignation gives way to resolve. The task before you is not to beg for a kinder version of exploitation, nor to wait for salvation from above. It is to organize, to unite across every manufactured division, and to transform consciousness into action. History does not move through patience. It moves through struggle. Every right won, every chain broken has been achieved not through permission, but through collective resistance. A society organized for human need, rather than profit, is not a fantasy, it is the logical outcome of recognizing that production is already social while ownership remains private. The contradiction cannot be reformed away, it must be overcome. When labor takes control of what it creates, when workers govern the condition of their own lives, exploitation loses its foundation and ideology loses its grip. The future will not be handed to you by those who benefit from the present. It will be built by those who refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable and inequality is just. Once the working class ceases to see itself as a collection of isolated individuals and begins to act as a conscious historical force, the question is no longer whether the system can change, but how long it can survive. Workers of the world, the moment you recognize yourselves in one another, the lie collapses, the fear shifts, and history begins to move again.